to turn in your Bible to 1 Samuel chapter 17. 1 Samuel 17. Another occasion when we're missing a lot of folks today, but we're sure glad you're here. We're grateful for your presence and thankful for this occasion that we can come together and think about the Word of God. Lord willing, next week I plan to resume our study on leadership in the local church. We had a lesson and we said we were going to present some lessons. It was a suggested subject, and I'm glad that it was a subject we've looked at in the past on different occasions through the years, but it's good to look at it again. Lessons on elders, shepherds of a local flock, those who would be the bishops, the overseers. What do those terms mean? What does the Bible teach? What about deacons? Where do they fit into God's plan in a fully organized church? We'd like to say some things about that subject and go back to that subject. Lord willing, next week we'll plan to do that. Tonight, I would like to present a lesson from 1 Peter chapter 1. And I wonder if you might take a minute this afternoon to read over that chapter again. It'll be familiar territory to you. But what I'd like to do, Lord willing, is to think about the concept of purity as it's applied in 1 Peter 1. So take 5 minutes if you can today, and if you would, read that chapter, think about purity as it relates to what Peter is writing about. And we'll try to present some thoughts along that line tonight. I hope and think it maybe it will be of use to you to think ahead along that line. This morning, I'd like to spend just a minute on a very familiar passage. One of the most familiar stories of the Old Testament involves the story of David and Goliath. But I think it can rightly be said that this story is really about not just a battle that took place on the plains west of Judah, but a battle that took place in the hearts of men. And it really is, I think, a parallel for the kind of battle that goes on with all of us every day. If you're there in 1 Samuel 17, and I'm reading from the Old King James Version, verse 1 begins this way. Now the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle, and were gathered together at Shochoh, which belongeth to Judah, and pitched between Shochoh and Azekah in Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together and pitched by the valley of Elah, and set the battle in array against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side. And there was a valley between them. You know, a lot of things have changed through the years, but the ground's still there. You can go to the place where this battle took place. There were 5 of the major cities of the Philistines, and not too far from Gath, which, by the way, is the hometown of a famous Philistine, we find Azekah and Shochoh, and we find this creek, this wadi that runs between them. And it was in this area, the valley of Elah, that the story we read about takes place. Here's an aerial view of that area, and you can see how that the armies would be camped on one side and the other along the hills, and the valley that ran between them, where the creek was also running, would be the place where this event happened. Here's another view of the lay of the land as it looks today, and you can imagine this story taking place in this very spot. We'll get to that in just a minute. So we find next there was a champion that went out to make a proclamation on this ground. By the way, that word champion, if you look in Young's literal translation, I found it interesting. The word is translated there, duelist. When we think about a champion in this context, think about that. It was not that uncommon in ancient times where you had more of the hand-to-hand fighting for an army to challenge another army in single combat. Sometimes it would be the kings. One king would challenge another king. Let's just, you and I fight out here, and the winner will be the winner, and then the others will serve the one whose side wins. In this case, you have Goliath, who is the champion, the duelist of the Philistines, and for rather obvious reasons. He was named Goliath of Gath. Verse 4 says his height was 6 cubits and a span. Now, you and I know that sometimes it's a little difficult to get the exact measurements in translating these old terms. We remember how that a cubit was basically the length from the tip of your longest finger to your elbow. Of course, that would vary with different people depending on how long your arm was. A span would be the span of a hand. But it is generally thought that, trying to apply this to this case, that Goliath would have been a man somewhere in the neighborhood of 9.5 feet tall. And it wasn't just that he was tall. Verse 5 gives us an idea, though his weight is not given, something of his girth and his strength. He had a helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. One source that I checked suggested that somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 pounds. There, folks in this room don't weigh 150 pounds. 150 pounds of armor. If that's anywhere close, that tells you something. He had greaves of brass upon his legs and targets of brass between his shoulders. And the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam. And his spearhead weighed 600 shekels of iron. That's always got me too. You know, that's suggested to be somewhere in the neighborhood of about 20 pounds. Now that's not the spear, that's the spearhead. That doesn't include the shaft, which would be considerable weight in itself. But the spearhead was somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 pounds. You ever try to throw 20 pounds? You ever been bowling? You ever try to throw a bowling ball? I mean, you can roll a bowling ball, you wouldn't throw one very far. That bowling ball don't weigh 20 pounds. And so here is a spear with a head weighing 20 pounds. That's his weapon. And he's got this tremendous armor on. And I say that to say, in trying to picture Goliath, I don't know, somehow these two guys always come to mind. One of them is a guy named Wadlow, I think it was. He's famous as the Guinness World Record holder for the tallest man in history. And he was about 8 feet, 10 inches, I think, or 11 inches, something like that. So he was quite a tall fella, and he had some size on him. This guy is a wrestler. Some of you guys know more about wrestling than I do. His name was Andre the Giant. Even if you don't follow wrestling, you knew about him. He was famous, celebrity as well. Now, he wasn't nearly as tall as this fellow. He wasn't even tall as Goliath was. But I always imagined that Goliath must have looked about like that. Did I tell you, by the way, I met this guy one time? I didn't really meet him. But I had an encounter with Andre the Giant one time. Years ago, I was in high school, and we went up to Birmingham for Alabama was playing a basketball game down at the arena. And several of us from high school went up there, and we parked downtown. We weren't sure exactly where we were. So after the game let out, we took a shortcut, and it so happened to be an alley down by the Boutwell Auditorium. And unbeknownst to us, apparently they had some sort of wrestling event there that night. And as we were walking along, 3 of us, I think it was, pretty nervous, looking around each, going through this alleyway at night in Birmingham. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, a noise like that. And we startled and we looked up, and the old windows there, you used to be able to open those things up like that. And out of that window came an arm like it was this big. And a face came down. It looked like this. That's who it looked like. Looked like that. And the face looked down like that. Apparently, he was in town. It couldn't be anybody else. I promise you. I never met him before since, but it could not have been anybody else. And we looked up at that face, and he looked down at it, and we ran to our car. We got to our car quickly after that. So I have actually met this fella. Sort of. I'm sure you wouldn't remember. But anyway, I think about fellows like that who are physically intimidating. But I don't think either one of these guys really was any match for the Philistine champion, Goliath. He was an impressive physical specimen. And he stood, verse 8 in our text, and he cried unto the armies of Israel. And he said to them, why are you come out to set your battle in array? Am I not a Philistine? And ye the servants of Saul, choose a man for you and let him come down to me. And if he be able to fight with me and kill me, we'll be your servants. And if I prevail against him and kill him, ye shall be our servants. He said in verse 10, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. He didn't just defy the armies of Israel. He defied Israel. He defied the God of Israel as well. Now this went on, the text goes on to tell us, 40 days, every morning and every evening, the same speech, 40 days. It wasn't as if Israel didn't notice. It'd be impossible to miss it. And Saul, verse 11, and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, and the old King James reads, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Well, I think I know what greatly afraid means. But in checking on this Hebrew word translated here, dismayed, one of the definers that I checked suggested it's a word which means to be shattered. And I thought, yeah, that's about right. Every day they came out there and they were just shattered by the sight, the voice, the presence, the arrogance of this great duelist of the Philistines, Goliath. Well, it just so happened on a particular occasion that somebody who wasn't normally present was present, and that was David. David was a young man. He had 3 brothers in the army. Verse 13 tells us Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, 3 brothers that were in the army. And he was up there bringing some supplies and getting some things from them. And normally he kept sheep at home. That's what David did at this point. He wasn't considered, I guess, old enough to be an asset to the army. So David comes, rises up early in the morning, verse 20, and he leaves the sheep with the keeper. And he does as his father told him. And he comes to the trench, and the host was going forth to fight, shouting for battle. But every morning that'd be put to an end by the challenge of Goliath. So David comes, and he brings his gift. And as he was talking with the men there who kept the carriage, verse 23 says, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, and spake according to the same words, and David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him. They were sore afraid. And the men of Israel said, have you seen this man that is come up? Surely to defy Israel has he come up. And it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich him to give him great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. David couldn't believe what he was hearing. He said, what? I'm sure he was thinking, I'll kill this guy for free. You could get what for this? And David said, tell me again, what is the offer here? And he's asking another. And this time his brother Eliab hears him, and he's, I guess, rather embarrassed that his younger brother seems to have more courage than he does. So he shames him, and as I used to say, sons him, sons him and said, what are you doing here? And what are those few sheep you're responsible for? You can't even keep up your little job you've got. You're going to run the army now? I know your pride, the naughtiness of your heart. You come to see the battle. Verse 29, David said, is there not a cause? That's the King James reading. I like that reading. Is there not a cause? You turn from him to ask another to make sure what he was hearing. Well, David's asking about all this was noticed. He's the only guy that's not running for the bushes. So somebody tells Saul about it, and Saul calls for him. And David said to Saul, verse 32, he said, "Look, let no man's heart fail because of this fellow. I'll go and fight him. Thy servant will go and fight this Philistine." And Saul said, "You're not able to go against this Philistine to fight him. You're a youth. He'd been a man of war from his youth." And David said to the king, rather boldly, but truly, he said, "I'm a shepherd. I keep my father's sheep, but I keep them. There was one time when a lion came and a bear to take a lamb out of the flock. And I went after him, and I smote him, and I delivered out of his mouth the one that he had taken. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and I smote him, and I slew him." And I'm going to tell you, thy servant slew a lion and a bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine to be as one of them. He defies the armies of the living God. David said, "Moreover, the Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear, he shall deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with thee." He tried to give David his armor. David didn't know how to use Saul's armor. So David put them aside. In verse 40 says he took with him what he had. He had a shepherd's staff. That was clear enough. And he chose 5 smooth stones out of the brook to put them in the shepherd's bag to use with his sling. Not a slingshot, but you know what a sling is. You have a pouch that's with 2 strings attached to the side, and someone with practice, I've seen this, maybe you have too, can put a stone in that pouch and put those 2 strings into his finger in such a way as to be able to swing it around and release one and to aim it and to do great damage with these. And so it was David's determination to do so. So David goes forth to meet the enemy, to meet the challenge. The Philistine verse came on and drew near to David. And the man that bare the shield went before him. And the Philistine looked about, and he saw David, and he disdained him, for he was but a youth, and ruddy, and of a fair countenance. He's a kid. And the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog? You come after me with a stick?" And he defied David, cursed him by his gods. The Philistine said to David, he said, "You come over here, and I'll give your flesh to the fowl of the air, to the beast of the field." And David said to the Philistine, "You come after me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand. And I will smite thee, and I will take thine head from thee, and I will give thy carcass unto the and to the carcasses of the host of the Philistines, to the fowl of the air and the wild beast of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear. The battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." And so David hastened and ran toward the Philistine. And the text says that David put his hand into his bag. He took a stone, he slang it. He smote the Philistine in the forehead, and the stones sunk into his forehead and he fell upon his face to the earth. David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone. And he smote the Philistine and slew him. There was no sword in David's hand, and therefore David ran and stood upon the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of his sheath thereof and slew him and cut off his head therewith. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled, and the men of Israel then, verse 52, it's always been a little bit funny. All the folks have been hiding behind the trees and in the bushes. Suddenly now, they are filled with courage. And the men of Israel and Judah rose up and shouted and pursued after the Philistines until you come to the valley, to the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell down by the way of Shaharim, even to Gath, unto Ekron. The children of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines, and they spoiled their tents. It was quite a victory, quite an amazing story that took place there. But as we pointed out from the title, when you think about it, the real battle that took place here was not so much with slings or with swords. The real battle that took place here had to do with the mind of David. A mind filled with faith as opposed to being filled with fear. The battle is ultimately won not just without, but first within. And I think that's the great lesson that I need and I want to share with you today. There's power in fear. Fear can be a very powerful thing. It occurs to us when you look at this story that Israel was defeated by Goliath. Goliath hadn't, as far as I know, he hadn't shed a drop of blood. But the whole army was coward just from the fear of Goliath, without the battle ever having been fought. He just seemed so invincible. He seemed so powerful. He seemed so overwhelming. He was filled with such bluster, such loud confidence, that those who were in the right were afraid. And I think about in our own lives, how we face forces that seem to be so overwhelming and so powerful. We might find ourselves sometimes in some place where we are intimidated physically by some power. It's not as much of a stretch as it would have been when I was a boy to imagine that someone in this audience, or several in this audience, might yet see the day when they are brought up on charges, the United States versus you. And the charge will not be some criminal activity that you have, some moral lapse on your part, not for stealing, not for doing violence to someone. No, the charge will be that you defied the government by worshiping God. You defied the government by reading the Bible or owning a Bible. Let me tell you, that's happened in other places. And we hear things and have heard things over the last year that really chill our blood. But here's the question. What are you going to do when you're standing against something that big? That's even bigger than Goliath, isn't it? And what are you going to do? Well, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. Maybe that wouldn't be worth a lot for me to tell you what I'm going to do. But I need to understand this. I know what I ought to do. And I know that if I allow fear to rule me, then I'll be just as big a failure as those folks were in the story we just read. David did not allow the fear of the great and the blustery to cow him into doing what he knew was wrong. Sometimes that power can be an economic power. There may well be folks in this audience who have at some point in their life lost a job because they wouldn't do what was wrong. You know what's right. Just sign that. I can't sign that. Well, just tell them, I can't tell them that. If you don't tell them that, you don't work here. Okay. But I can't do what's wrong. Sometimes, how are we going to pay the light bill? How are we going to get along? How can I go home and don't have a job? I think the way the godly man thinks is, how can I go home in sin against God? That's worse than anything else. We face a lot of Goliaths in life if we think about it. And if we allow fear to rule us, then we are indeed a sad and tragic story. Sometimes it involves other things. The failure of fellows is a factor as well in all of this. I think that it was The thing that impresses us the most about David's story we just read, to me, is not just the fact that he stood, but that he stood alone. Saul didn't stand. Saul wasn't going out there to fight Goliath. So what do you do when your leaders and the folks that you ought to be looking to for strength wilt? What you going to do? What are you going to do when the rest of your family wilts? I'm not going to get into it, but I was just thinking about them recently. It's one of the saddest things that I've ever seen. There's a family I knew, not in Alabama, but I worked with them for years. And I thought of them at one point as some of the strongest people that I knew. But I've watched the devil just completely destroy that family. Took the father by death in terrible circumstances. The mother who held firm and strong, but her parents were not Christians. And her father died, and she was extremely close, as daughters are to their father. And then her children did not obey, and the ones that did obey wandered away, and eventually she just washed out too. I tell you, there was a time when I would have thought she's as strong as any Christian I've ever met. I saw her undergo a lot of struggles and do the right thing and do the right thing and do the right thing. But it got to the point where so many people that were so close to her turned away from God. I guess, I never could get her to tell me, but I guess that just was what caused her to just give up in the end. You know, the devil fights dirty, and he knows no principles. But it certainly is something I've thought about through the years. What would you do, you know, if everybody you knew, including the folks closest to you, just quit? I know what you ought to do. I know what I ought to do. That may be a Goliath that you and I have to face. We're going to find out in that time whether we really believe, whether our faith is personal and genuine. I think David faced that kind of problem. You know, the fear of low expectations, the fear that comes from just, who expected David to be the hero of this story? Nobody. Nobody. The failure that was going on there, nobody was looking and saying, why doesn't David do something about this? David was a kid. And when he volunteered, they didn't even want to take his help. And I say that to the young folks here. But to all of us in some way. You know, brother of mine used to make the point. He said one of the things that he had experienced in his life in church troubles, and they are a sad reality, he said invariably through the years, and he'd been preaching 50 years, 60 years, he said invariably when the trials come, he said you'll find two things. You'll find some folks you thought were strong that wash out, and you'll find some folks that you really, to your shame, didn't think much of, that you come to realize were really strong. And I guess David fit that last category, wouldn't he? He said, here's a guy, and, you know, he's just a kid. You need to go back to the sheep. David says, is there not a cause? God expected more of David than his fellows did. David knew what was right. David took his stand for right. And he did what was right. And it was not anything less than what he should have done. Let me mention before we close, and as we close, on the other side of that picture, that I think this story reveals the danger of fear that will destroy and rot us inside. It also speaks to the power of faith. I mentioned a moment ago, I like that expression in verse 29 of the King James Version, is there not a cause? That is to say, isn't there something here worth fighting for? Isn't there something here worth getting upset about? Isn't this important? What held David strong was the fact that he had leaned on God before. That's what he told the king. King said, how can you be so sure you win this fight? He said, because God's been with me all along. He's carried me all along. And this fellow's not going to be any different. I'm going to do what's right. I realize this fact too. the battle is the Lord's. It belongs to Him. And therefore, I can have confidence that whatever comes, whatever happens, let God's will be done. But I'm going to do my duty, my job. I wanted to read from the 3rd Psalm in connection with these last 2 points. If you turn to Psalm 3, this is a psalm of David. It is said to be later in David's story. The story we read, of course, is David as a young man. David, in his history, had a very traumatic circumstance where he was facing rebellion from his son Absalom, who was no small power. David had fallen deeply. He had come back by the grace of God, but he also was facing a lot of the consequences of his sin. And it's in that time, many years after the story of Goliath, it's in that time that he writes this psalm, Psalm 3. Well, look at verse 3. O thou, Lord, art a shield for me, my glory and the lifter up of mine head. I cried unto the Lord with my voice, and he heard me out of his holy hill. And so this is what he said as he's fleeing from Absalom, a man who's lived his life leaning on God. He says, I laid me down and slept. I awaked, for the Lord will sustain me, and I will not be afraid of tens of thousands of people that have set themselves against me round about. Let me tell you, when you get to the point when you can face whatever comes in life with that kind of attitude, then we'll understand more about what faith really is. The battle belongs to God, and the Lord is on your side. He does not promise necessarily that you and I will always come out unscathed. What he does promise is that ultimately the Lord will take care of us. Let me read one passage from Hebrews chapter 11, and we'll close with this passage. Hebrews chapter 11 is that great treatise on faith. And the truth is that in some battles, Goliath seems to win. But he never wins over an individual, ultimately, whose faith is in God, and that faith is unshakable. He talks here about those who through faith, verse 33 of Hebrews 11, subdued kingdoms and wrought righteousness and obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, and turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. We can win the fight. We can find our place in the service of God, but we have to win the battle within. Will your anchor hold in the storms of life? May the Lord help us to have that kind of faith that will allow us to believe and trust in God and put pleasing Him above every other consideration. I hope you'll pray for me in that regard, that I might do that. Pray for each other. Please get out your songbooks and turn to the number that Brother Purvis selected. If you're here this morning and you desire to obey the gospel, we encourage you to do that. Be baptized into Christ for the remission of sins based on your faith and repentance. If you're here as one who has a child of God, who's not been faithful to the Lord, you need to return to Him. Maybe there's some need you have of the prayers of the saints. We'd be glad again to assist you. Let us know how we can do that, please, right now while we stand.